And he said he was in 30 schools and 10 years of foster care.
Oh my God.
That is ridiculous. How are they supposed to learn when they're constantly changing schools? It's not possible. And right now, foster care alumni cost this country $300,000 a year because
That is insane.
Isn't that insane? And that's because they're on government assistance. They're homeless. They don't have a diploma. People don't talk about kids in foster care. Our exposure to kids in foster care is via media. If there's a crime committed, always they somehow bring in, well, and they were a foster student. What does that do to us? Oh, all foster kids are ending up being criminals. Bring awareness to what's happening with our foster kids because they need us. They really do. And they need to be talked about and admired, not treated like victims, not treated like potential criminals, but like kids who just need to be loved, respected, and admired for what they've gone through.
Welcome to the Wheel With It podcast with your host, Devon. Let's get into the episode.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Wheel With It, where this computer seems to be possessed by a ghost or something. But today we have Sharon Dunlevy on the podcast with us today. How are you, Sharon?
I'm doing good. How are you, Devon?
Good. So tell us about yourself, and then we will get started.
Sure. So I'm Sharon Dunlevy, and I am an educational advocate for children in foster care. I live in just outside of Indianapolis with my husband, and our 23-year-old child lives in our basement while they're looking for a place to live, maybe overseas. And we have one dog named Sparkle, and we're pretty adventurous. We like to go and do a lot of different things, and Indianapolis is a great place to live because it's central. We can get to a lot of stuff, plus there's just a lot going on in the Indy area. So we've been here 2025, so we've been here 25 years. So just a quick intro to me.
Tell us about what you do and why you're here. And
Sure. So as an educational advocate for children in foster care, what I do is there are 3 laws that work together to help kids in foster care get the education they need when they're implemented correctly. And so what I do is I train foster parents on those 3 laws and how to make sure that they're being implemented. And if they're not, where do they need to go in order for the schools to comply with those laws? And unfortunately, that happens a lot. And it's not that the schools don't want to comply. It's just sometimes they don't even know, right? They just don't know what the laws are. So I think it's important for foster parents to know what those laws are so that they can be the best advocates for their kids. I worked for a licensing agency first as an educational advocate before I went out on my own. And they recognized that kids needed extra help educationally, but a lot of states do not have educational advocates on their staff, or they have a support person, but they have to cover the entire state. And that's impossible to do. Yeah. So I want to fill that gap by making sure that the foster parents can do the best that they can do in terms of advocating for the kids and their educational needs.
yes, and I know that's impossible because I'm on a Medicaid waiver services, and luckily Virginia is like the best state in the union for Medicaid. Literally, I bet if you came down here to Virginia, you'd have a much easier time, at least if they needed Medicaid, because
Yeah, and all foster kids are on Medicaid. That is part of what happens when you enter foster care. You immediately get Medicaid. And even if they age out, if they're not adopted, or if they're not adopted before the age of 16, or they just age out and go out on their own, they maintain Medicaid because they don't have that family insurance in order to rely on.
Yeah, but Medicaid waivers are specifically for people with disabilities. Are you familiar with those at all?
Yes, foster kids, because of their trauma, often have developmental disabilities as well. And one of the 3 laws that I talk about with my foster parents and that I advocate for them using is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act.
Yep.
And Yeah, and I asked them to go to their schools and get their kids tested for a individualized education plan or an IEP. And because trauma does mimic a lot of developmental disabilities like ADHD, autism, those types of things, the schools need to understand what's going on in the kid's head. Trauma physically affects how the brain develops, and so you will see that a child who has suffered abuse or neglect or any other type of trauma, their brain actually can be smaller than it should be. And I have a graphic that I use where like the 3-year-old brain is like this big and it's all developed inside. And a trauma brain is only this big and there's all this white space around it. And that's part of the brain that's not being used. And that's just because trauma has affected that brain growth. There are ways to overcome this. Our brains are designed to grow and to change, and so we can overcome some of that. But if we don't understand what trauma is and what it does to the brain, we don't use the right tools then to overcome that. So kids with trauma really do need those IEPs and really need the extra help, just like you would with any other developmental disability.
So, what are the 3 laws? And then we'll get into what trauma is.
Sure. So the 3 laws are the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. And what that one does is, before ESSA was in place in 2016, kids in foster care fell under what's called McKinney-Vento, which is the Homelessness Act. What happened was they were just lumped in with homeless kids, but they were never looked at individually in terms of like how were their grades, were they graduating, all of these things. And kids in foster care are different than homeless kids, and they may bounce back and forth, but there is some differences in how their needs and their trauma and all of this. So they moved the foster kids into this Every Student Succeeds Act. Some of the things that did was it allowed students in foster care to stay in one school, even if they changed homes over and over again, because they were finding that constant changing of schools was causing them to lose learning time.
That is awesome.
Yes, it makes a huge difference, because I just talked to a former foster kid 2 days ago, and he said he was in 30 schools in 10 years of foster care.
Oh my God.
That is ridiculous. How are they supposed to learn when they're constantly changing schools? It's not possible. And so they need to stay in one school. The other thing is, if they do need to change schools, they have to be enrolled immediately. And what happens with kids in foster care is their records don't always follow them. So schools used to say, we can't enroll you until we have your birth certificate, social security card, and shot records. Who knows where those records are? They could be with bio parents, they could be with foster families 3 times ago. They're not always there. And so ESSA said, basically, you have to enroll the kids immediately, regardless of lack of records. And what that does, again, is it keeps the kids in school. They're not losing learning time, and that's what's most important.
With the immediate enrollment, like, how do you make sure that, because I think about like fraud and stuff all the time because it's so like rampant in Medicaid, which I don't know how they get away with it, but that's a whole other podcast. How do you make sure the kids are who they say they are, the parents are who they say they are?
So when a kid enters into foster care and they become a ward of the state, there's all sorts of paperwork, and that's all that the school needs. So whatever is registered with the state is basically the guardians, and then they appoint the foster parents to be that representative guardian for them, for the state. So all they need is that letter from the state saying this child is in foster care in this home. And that's all the schools need in order to enroll them. So it does make it official, which I've never really thought about that, Devon. So I'm glad you asked that question, because that's not been brought up before. I know this, and I don't think to tell people that. But yes, so there is ways to protect that there isn't some parent trying to enroll a kid that they kidnapped from another state or something like that, because it's a letter straight from the state that they're the wards of. So the next law that I do is that Individuals with Disabilities Act, the IDEA. And so as I said, I make sure that they get those IEPs if they can. If they can't, let's say that their trauma causes them to have behavioral issues, but their grades are not suffering. They also can get a 504 plan, which is basically just a behavior modification plan. And it talks about how the school is going to work with the students and the foster parents on modifying their behavior without, again, kicking them out all the time, having them suspended all the time, having them go to the principal's office. Because anytime a kid, foster or not, is outside of that classroom, they're losing learning time. So we need to keep our kids in the classroom, and we need to be doing more behavior modification in the classroom and less outside of the classroom. Now, in our climate where we tend to underfund schools and we're not giving the teachers the supports that they need, more people in their classroom, more adults in their classroom if they're going to have 30 plus kids in their classroom. So I understand that becomes an issue. However, my focus has to be on the kid. My focus has to be centered on what's best for this child, and what's best for the child is to be in that classroom to learn. The final law that I teach is what's called Family First Prevention Services Act. And this is not an education bill, but it includes education vouchers. So this is a bill that when a child hits 14 in foster care, they have to start having what's called transition services. So it's services that they're going to work with somebody specifically on independent living skills. Because, like I said, my 23-year-old lives in our basement because the housing market here in Indianapolis is ridiculous. And we don't want them to waste their money on rent, right? If they're going to move out, we want them to move out into a house that they buy. And they have money set aside for that, but it's just ridiculous right now. And I know it's everywhere. So they live in our basement. They had somebody to fall back on. Foster kids don't have that. Who are they going to live with? A lot of them age out and end up living with the parents that were the problem in the first place. So they don't have those independent living skills. So Family First is supposed to help them get those independent living skills. It also, let's say a kid is not going to go to college. They want to go to some place to learn to be a mechanic. There are education vouchers for that. And those vouchers can go all the way up to the age of 21 to help them get those skills that they need to be a productive member of society. Right now, foster care alumni cost this country $300,000 a year because
that is insane.
Isn't that insane? And that's because they're on government assistance. They're homeless. They don't have a diploma. All these things that didn't happen when they were in school that help them learn to be a member of society that's working is now going to drain us. And so we need to build those skills. We need to be doing things early on. And so that's where that Family First Services Prevention Services Act comes in. So those are the 3 laws I teach.
What can schools do to educate their staff on these laws and all that stuff?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And what I say is understanding trauma is going to be a 2-part thing. You've got the ones who are on the ground. You got the boots on the ground. So my parents that I work with need to be trained by somebody like me on these laws. Then the school staffs need to be trained on these laws as well. So professional development, because right now it's not happening into higher ed. They also need to be trained on what trauma-informed care looks like, because a child with trauma needs different discipline than a child with ADHD. And what happens in the schools is they've become so reliant on parents giving their kids drugs, medication for things like ADHD, so that it calms the kids down.
Oh my God, they're so over-medicated.
They're so over-medicated.
I mean, I'm not anti-medication, like anxiety medication saved my life, but like,
right.
they're over-medicated.
Yeah. And let's say I see 3, 4, and 5-year-olds on ADHD meds. 3, 4, and 5-year-olds are supposed to be ADHD. That is just developmentally where they should be. But the problem is trauma might mimic ADHD, but ADHD meds don't work for trauma. The only thing that works for trauma is therapy and trauma-informed practices. And those are very different than typical disciplines. Like I said, I'm really against sending kids out of the classroom because that takes them away from the learning environment and it triggers their trauma. Anytime a child with trauma is isolated, that's a trigger because their trauma usually related to something that happened to them when they were one-on-one with an adult and nobody else was around to protect them. And so we can't re-trigger them by sending them one-on-one with the principal or something like that. It's just going to make it worse. They also, trauma does not like to be individualized or singled out. So when you pull out a child who's acting up in front of the entire class, they're just going to act up more. So there's all these different things. So the schools need to be doing a lot of professional development on trauma-informed care. And then at this higher level, the higher ed departments need to start training teachers and school staff in trauma, and not just one 3-credit course, but a series of courses on how to understand trauma. And this is going to become more and more important because not just foster kids have trauma. All kids today have some trauma. They've been exposed to trauma in some way just because of social media. When I was growing up, if there was a school shooting, which there weren't, but even if there was a school shooting when I was growing up, I wouldn't know about it unless my parents told me or I happened to be watching the news with them. Now kids are on social media. They know things before we even do as parents. We're working all day. We haven't looked at social media. We haven't looked at the news. And we come home and the kids are like, did you hear about this? Did you hear about this and this? And we hadn't even heard about it yet. Kids are so exposed to trauma experiences.
And even if they aren't on it, because I know a lot of parents that like, I give my kid a phone to call and text on. They're not left with nothing but no social media. But even if they are not on it, their friends are.
Their friends are, yes. And honestly, I would not give kids a phone before middle school. But that's just my personal opinion. As long as they are in the company of an adult at all times, they don't need a phone. Now, when my child went into middle school and it was summer band camp and they would be sitting in the hallway of the middle school waiting for their turn to go in for summer band camp, we started giving them a phone because they were by themselves. There were no adults around other than the teacher that was already in the classroom with the whatever instruments they were working with. But until they're by themselves, they don't really need a phone. But like you said, they're exposed to it. Their friends have phones. They can look at their friends' phones. And let me tell you, kids are good at hacking. I don't care what you say. You can put every block you want on. Yeah. And they know how to get around it.
They're so good at it. I'm like, how are you?
The military should be hiring our kids to be hacking into whatever, the Russians and stuff, because they're the ones that know how to do it. But honestly, so you cannot, no matter what you think, you're not going to protect your kids from trauma exposure completely. So then we need to be talking about it. That's the problem, right? We don't talk about these things. That's why I'm here with you, Devon, right? Is because I told you early, people don't talk about kids in foster care. Our exposure to kids in foster care is via media. If there's a crime committed, always they somehow bring in, well, and they were a foster student. What does that do to us? Oh, all foster kids are ending up being criminals. No.
Yeah. And like, even if they are, like, I'm not excusing it, but like, probably because
of their trauma. But that doesn't mean every foster kid is destined to be a criminal. And that seems to be the way we look at it. One of the issues you were asking about schools and what schools can do, one of the things that when I talk to foster kids and former foster kids that they feel like is once a teacher knows that they're in foster care, there's this sense of, oh, they're going to act up. And it may be because their trauma is so easily triggered. That is a brain thing. That's nothing to do with anything else other than that they're in survival mode. But there is this idea that we blame the victim. And I say this a lot. We can't blame the kids for their trauma. We can't treat them as if they're going to be a problem because they're acting out because something happened to them. They're the victim, and we need to treat them as regular kids who happen to be in foster care, who need a little extra help when they're triggered. And we need to work with, one of the things I teach my foster parents is work with the schools. Let's set up a positive relationship early on. Talk with the teachers about what are these kids' triggers that I know of, and tell the teacher, if you see a trigger, let me know. Let's work together to help the child do well in school. And so those positive relationships between foster family and school is really important. And it's something I really try and focus on when I'm teaching my foster parents.
What is like the biggest need for foster
It's
care?
Yeah, for me, I would say it is better educational outcomes. What happens, and this is why there are not educational advocates like me out there, what happens is kids have so much trauma, so much safety issues, things like that, that we tend to forget that it's important for them to get a good education in order to be successful as adults. I'm going to throw out some statistics because I think it opens people's eyes. 1/4 of the kids who are in foster care will not get a high school diploma.
That is
That's a lot.
like crazy. Like that's
Yes.
like epidemic level. Like
Yes, exactly. 20%, we're going to end up homeless at some point, and that number may be going up from what I understand.
holy cow.
Another
Why is
20%,
it going up? Because of housing prices?
yeah. Part of it is housing prices. Part of it is just this lack of empathy in our society. They don't give them a chance, right? If they mess up on the job, instead of saying, oh, let's work together and try and figure out why that customer made you mad or something, they're just immediately fired. Foster kids have a hard time holding on to a job because their trauma is not gone. Trauma is one of those things that's like alcoholism, like everything else. It comes back. It's a flashback. We have to constantly work on it. And you were talking about Medicaid. So yes, kids in foster care do have Medicaid, but sometimes they lose those benefits. Sometimes they.
Oh my god! If you like, yeah, some states have found, like Virginia, have found workarounds for the federal regulations. Thank God.
Yes,
But
but
in some states, if you make $1 over, you're out.
yeah,
I'm like,
you're out, and then you can't get back on.
yeah, and you're like priority 3 because like giving up the services before. I'm like, yeah, because I actually went to work and tried to
Right.
work.
Yes. Why is it that these are kids who can work, but if they work, then they lose their benefits. That doesn't make sense. And then we're talking about fraud and all this stuff. And it's like, come on, guys. It's the way the law is set up. We've
Like,
set people up to fail.
There is fraud, and
Not
that is the big issue. But like the bigger issue, not the bigger, but as big of the issue is the way the freaking law is.
exactly. And it just works against them. Yeah. So kids don't know how to hold a job. And then 20% of them are going to end up in jail. Again, that's a huge number of kids that are ending up in jail. And that's all because they're coming out, they're not happy in school, they're not learning. A lot of kids will tell you they just dropped out. Like they felt bullied, they felt like nobody understood them, they felt dumb because they couldn't catch up. And so they just drop out. And then once they get, again, if you drop out of foster care and then you decide, oh, I really need this help, it's really hard to get back in when you're a teenager.
Yeah, it's
yeah. I know. That's what I do, Devon, all the time is I sigh. How many times do we sigh when we think about our kids? Because let's be real, it's our kids. I know I'm talking about them as adults, but they're still kids sometimes in their head. Trauma does that. Trauma makes us a little more immature.
yeah, and these people that have never had a disability or been through anything, like
They
or
don't understand.
experience anything, like they're like I will put the link in the chat. I'll put the link in the show notes. Have you seen Patrice the movie on Hulu?
No, I don't have Hulu. I have not.
Okay, first of all, you need to find a way to watch that movie because
Okay.
it is
I'm writing it down right now.
like insanely good. It's
Okay.
about these two people. They're a couple. They both have disabilities and they want to get married and live together, but they can't because of the way the benefits are set up.
I saw that on your profile that like you advocate for that, and I didn't even know that was a thing.
Yeah.
Like, right?
And
These are things we don't even know. And I work in this field and I didn't know that was a thing.
yes, I
Oh,
worry about it every day because it directly
yes.
affects me.
Yes.
And anyway, I was privileged enough. I am so glad that they said yes because I'm like, there's no way they're gonna say yes. We don't have enough viewers. But I guess because I had a disability, they said yes. And so I had the director and producer of that movie on, and they said that they talked to DC insiders about the issue.
Mhm.
One of the reasons that they won't pass the reform laws that are out there is awareness, which that one
Yeah.
I kind of get because people need to know where their tax
Right.
dollars are going and whatever.
Right.
But the other reason is they're afraid of an attack ad that says, hey, this person voted to spend more of your Social Security dollars faster. And I'm like, that is not what this is.
No.
You're spending more of them, yes, but you're not spending them any faster than you normally would.
No.
Like,
No. We have become such a country of fear, right? Things we don't understand, we fear. And then they use that fear against us with the voters. And that is that if somebody doesn't add, like if a politician doesn't add and it's all about hating other people or fearing where our money is going, I automatically tune them out. But so many people tune into those, like they really buy into this fear mongering. And I see it all the time. I try and stay off Facebook, but I'm also very political. And so I get sucked in, but I see it all the time with people on Facebook. They're talking about these things they don't understand, so they fear it. And then the politicians build on that. So what they're doing with this law, it sounds like, Devon, is that they're building this idea of fear around where's my money going? Who am I
yeah,
spending my money on? It's the same thing with the whole attack on the trans community. My kid that lives in my basement is trans. And there's this whole attack here in Indiana on the trans community and how much of our money is being spent on transition services, medical services, and transition things. My kid just went through one medical operation that was trans related, and they're paying for it. So, what does that have to do with anybody else other than my own child? Nobody's
I
paying for that for them.
I'll probably cut this out because we don't do politics on here.
Oh,
But like,
okay.
I'm a but like I'm a moderate Republican, so like as long as like the state isn't paying for it,
Hey,
they're paying for it, like it's fine.
yeah, exactly. It's
And
fun.
they're an adult and they're not like two, it's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's some of these things are nobody's business, but we build this fear and we make it our business. And it's no, just so you know, my advice is if you start seeing politicians building on fear, tune them out. Find the politicians who are offering solutions, not offering just the problems, right? That's what I really look for. Like, that's why I do these podcasts, because you asked me, what is it we need to know? What do we need to do to make things better for our kids? We need to talk about foster kids, but we need to talk about them in reality, not in foster kids are going to be destined to be in prison or destined to be homeless. We need to be talking about the fact that if we improve the educational systems for our foster kids, they could be destined to be productive members of society. And there are so many foster kids who are now out of the care who are doing incredible things. I have conversations with people all the time. I do podcasts with former foster kids who have just really changed the system and changed the way they live. And that's what we need to be looking at. One of the things that I've really been pushing and thinking about is we're in this country, we so favor people with college degrees still. We tend not to account for lived experience. So a former foster kid who had already struggled in school, they're going to struggle in college. They're not going to get that social work degree. So they can't work with other foster kids as a social worker. But
Which,
they have
they would know more than the social worker probably.
That's exactly right. They have the lived experience. So why are we not building a system where we count that lived experience for them and then just give them the little bit of training they need in order to how do you do the paperwork part? How do you talk with people? How do you not get triggered yourself while you're working with a family? Those are things we could train but not have to get this entire master's or bachelor's degree in social work.
And like, I would be down to do something like that too, because I don't have enough money to go back to school. And I mean, my parents paid for my bachelor's degree, but I'm like, I'm not going to spend all this money on a master's. And I'm like, I know more than the social worker probably does.
Absolutely, because you have that lived experience. And so we need to be tapping into that more. I've been following a lot of people on LinkedIn who are in the UK, and they are starting to do this. They're starting to create these jobs for people with lived experience. And I think that is fabulous. I told you I have a training contract with the state of Ohio. They favor lived experience in certain training sessions over those of us who have the degree. And I fully admit that I come from this from the outside. And I will tell people this. I come from this from the outside. I'm not a foster parent because of certain circumstances. I am not a former foster kid yet. I've listened. I've worked with them. I pay attention. And so I feel like I'm a good advocate because of that. And I feel like I can train them because of that. But I had to do a lot of work myself in order to be able to do that and not come at it as if I know more just because I have that degree. And not that every social worker does that, but there is some of that attitude out there.
God bless our social workers.
Absolutely.
Coordinators,
but they're not paid enough to really do what all they were supposed to be doing. I was doing a podcast with a former foster kid, and I kept calling the social workers that work with foster kids as entry level. And she's like, really triggering me on that. And I'm like, I know, but let's be real. We pay those social workers so little in the Department of Child Services.
Know how much we pay them. I'm like, what?
Yeah, so of course they consider it an entry-level job, right? They're just working in child services until they can find something better that pays more. It's an entry-level job, and it should not be. Period. It should not be. And so it's hard. It's really hard. We have a lot of issues. We have a lot of things we would have to change. But if we can just bring awareness to the fact that there are these kids out there that really want to succeed, they really want to be productive members of society, they want to graduate and have a family and live in a home and have a job they love, but they need some extra help to get there. And so that's what I talk about and what I try and do.
So what got you into this in the first place?
It's really funny. So my story starts like way back in 10th grade. I always thought I was going to be a scientist. And then in 10th grade, I took biology and I took child development class at the same time. We ran a preschool in our high school. I was horrible at biology, but I loved child development. And so from then on, I was all about kids. And every job I've had, I've jumped a lot of different jobs. Like I said, I was a children's minister for about 20 years, but I also worked in preschool. I did some work with trying to give scholarships to preschool teachers. I did some other work, and then I worked in the licensing agency as the educational advocate. I've always worked around kids, and I've just always had this heart for kids, but especially vulnerable kids. And so I left my church job because I wanted to start a special needs ministry within the church, and they didn't want me to, which was really sad. That was
okay.
Yeah, that was really sad. And everybody has the same reaction. Like, come on. Yeah, so I left ministry to serve more vulnerable kids, and that's what I've been doing. And one of the things that we can do is if you are out here listening and you're a member of a church, ask your church, what are they doing for foster kids in their area? Like foster families live in your community. They live in every community. People just don't know it. But you could be welcoming them into your church. You could be helping them collect. Foster kids tend to move home to home in garbage bags. Like that's not a lie. That actually happens. So they need suitcases. If you've got a suitcase laying around, see if a licensing agency would like that suitcase, because they can give it to a foster kid so they don't have to carry their junk or their stuff in a garbage bag. Those are just simple things that we could be doing. And that's how I got there, because I just always have this love for kids. And kids they're so moldable, right? But when we do things wrong, then we create these kids who grow up to be non-empathetic, non-compassionate. We have a lot of bullying in our culture, and that starts out at the young age when we allow them to be bullies, or we bully them and so they become bullies. I just want to see our kids succeed. I want to see kids grow up and be successful. And it's really hard to get there sometimes, but we need to go back to that whole idea of it takes a community or it takes a village to raise a family. And we need to get back to that idea that we all have a responsibility for the kids that are growing up, whether or not they are our kids or not.
Anything else that you would want to add before we get off here?
No, I think I've talked enough, probably. Everybody always says, when I talk to you, you're so passionate. And I'm very
could
passionate.
talk to you for like hours.
I could talk about my kids for hours, right? This is something that is just near and dear to my heart. And I just always appreciate people like you and the other podcasts I've been on for letting me come and just bring awareness to what's happening with our foster kids, because they need us. They really do. And they need to be talked about and admired, not treated like victims, not treated like potential criminals, but by kids who just need to be loved, respected, and admired for what they've gone through.
That's amazing. Anything else? Where can people keep up with you? Follow you on social media?
Yes, so come and find me on LinkedIn. That's the best place to find me. I am on Facebook, but honestly, LinkedIn is where I do most of my networking and communicating. So you can just find me on there. You can see my name on the screen, but it's Sharon Dunlevy, Dunlevy, and you'll find me on social media or on LinkedIn, and I would love to connect with people there.
That is amazing. Be sure to like this podcast, subscribe, hit the bell if you're on YouTube or Spotify. And we will see you guys next episode. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the show. Remember to follow the show and our guests on social media and subscribe. Be sure to hit the bell so you'll get notified when we upload new episodes. See you next time.